bedroom Marxist vibe. You know what I mean? Which is not my politics, and not a politics and a vibe that I think can build.
Wait, hang on though. But which of you is the one that's got the bust of Gramsci in their bathroom? Because
I have a little picture of Gramsci in my bathroom, but that's not my bedroom. That's my bathroom. So
Fair,
it's a completely different. So it's a completely different thing. It's a completely different thing. Completely different thing.
Hello, and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with your party, the Green Party, the New Left Party, whichever party we all find ourselves a part of. I'm your host, Shanice McBean, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Joe.
Hello.
And Jonas.
What's up?
With Your Party's Central Executive Committee elections reaching a showdown on the 23rd of February, drama between Corbyn's The Many slate and Zara Sultana's Grassroots Left slate reaching a messy and muddy new level, and speculation that this is the fork in the road between Your Party collapsing or limping on, Jonas is going to give us the lowdown in Your Party news. Over to you, Jonas.
Yeah, this week, after much anticipation, we're bringing you the latest from the Central Executive Committee elections. As of this week, you can now vote in the Your Party CEC elections to decide who going forward will lead this incipient but incredibly fragile political formation. To decide who the candidates on the ballot were that you'll be voting from, there were recently a round of endorsement where members decided who would make it on the ballot. There was a turnout of 11,000 members, which is roughly a fifth of the membership. So not great in these early stages, but it should just be insisted upon, this is the endorsement phase. It's worth reminding our listeners that there are two slates going into these elections. There's the Grassroots Left slate, affiliated to Zara Sultana, and there is the Many slate, cohered around Jeremy Corbyn, and there have also been scores of independents running too. Among the public office holders endorsed, that is elected representatives such as councillors, MPs, etc., Corbyn, Sultana, Shokat Adam, Ayub Khan, both from the group of independent MPs, all got endorsed, alongside figures such as Preston Independent Councillor Michael Lavalette, Coventry Councillor and Grassroots Left slate member Grace Lewis, and former Crew MP and the Many supporter Laura Smith. There were several others too. One observation I'd make here, which a good friend pointed out to me, is that whilst Corbyn topped the public office holders poll, the split in endorsements between him and Zara Sultana means that potentially there likely wasn't much crossover in the endorsement between them. So we're looking at quite a polarised election here, which when you think of Corbyn's demand that the Grassroots Left slate remove him from their list of endorsements, take your name out of my mouth style, that kind of polarization makes a lot of sense. It's also worth saying that independent candidates, particularly at the level of the regions, may have got less endorsements individually compared to slate affiliated members, but overall endorsements were higher for independents than they were for slate affiliated candidates. I think that's really worth considering. One big caveat to all of this is that I have had quite a few conversations now with people who have been punishingly quite engaged Your Party members who didn't even bother to endorse anybody. The endorsement results show a pretty fractured party, largely along factional lines. But when the final CEC results turn up, that may differ. You know, you may have a larger section of the membership who actually vote on the candidates who have made the ballot. But let's see what happens. I will say this, though. It may well end up being the case, and I think this is desirable, that the CEC will be made up of candidates from the Many slate, from the Grassroots Left slate, and from no slate at all. Personally, I wouldn't want either of these two slates to dominate this fragile organisation, in no small part because they clearly don't want to work with each other. And, you know, maybe something that we'll get into and continue to discuss on the pod is that they clearly aren't equipped to lead. Some of the people around Corbyn have briefed several times now that they will walk if they do not win, and particularly over the last week. And the culture of debate amongst these two groups of people, you know, if you just take a look at the cesspit that is Your Party Left Twitter, is really ludicrous. Like, people are taking chunks out of each other. Like, it's insane. People are talking about each other's mental health, their weight, comparing them to celebrities, like the reposting any old post of their rivals that has nothing really to do with factionalism through the frame of factionalism. It's just kind of pathetic. It looks really bad, and it's indicative of groups of people on both sides who have kind of failed to step back and think about the real world when thinking about this party, and, you know, failed to think about perception. Not all candidates on either slate do this. You know, in the West Midlands, we have a Democratic candidate, Sue Moffat, and we have a grassroots left candidate, Graham Jones, who are both good at thinking about the culture of the party in the bigger picture. And there are others like them across the country. But the culture amongst the core of each group and their supporters of riling one another up and throwing insults at each other is kind of gross, and it may be the thing that destroys this party before it's begun. And I think we should just be honest about that. And I think people involved should take responsibility for that. I just want to end on this little detail. We had Corbyn come up to Stoke a couple of weeks ago, and it was to promote the many slate, and it was kind of striking how little he said about the party in his contribution. And I kind of got up and I said, look, you know, when you walk into the space that we're in, the meeting room that we were in, you come across a space that has a children's area. We have tables where you can write down a question if you're not comfortable speaking. We have a kitchen where our comrades are making food for everyone in attendance. We understand what working class people are going through, so we try to model the politics that people can participate in, that they can feel, that they can shape. But the situation as it stands in your party isn't that. And I asked him, you know, after saying this, how he plans to model the politics which can be a version of that. And for all that I respect and really love this man, he didn't have an answer. And at the national level, on either side of this internal fight, very few of these people have an answer to this question. And that's really concerning for the future of this party. Thanks for that, Jonas. I think just to kick off the discussion on, I guess, a little bit more of a surface level. And I don't mean surface level in the sense that what I'm about to say is not important, but just on a surface level of kind of not getting too kind of deep into the logistics and the personalities. But I was really personally disappointed when Jeremy announced his slate, and I was kind of looking through all the candidates, and, you know, some of the candidates are really well established, really rooted in their communities, but there wasn't a single blackface. Not a single blackface. And this is disappointing on many fronts. I mean, the first reason being part of what they're standing on. You know, they've got three kind of core principles. Building our base, so organising and working class communities is the first one. The second one's reuniting our multiracial coalition. And then the third is kind of winning people to our politics. I just think of the fact that, you know, over the past 10 years, if you want to talk about organising and working class communities and building a mass politics and reuniting a multiracial coalition, the Black Lives Matter movement and movements that sprung from that in connection to kind of, you know, against state and police violence, so I'm thinking the Kill the Bill movement, these movements are absolutely essential to revitalising and keeping the traditions of mass social movement organising alive in Britain. And I think to not have someone on your slate that represents that tradition that isn't just 10 years old, goes back decades in Britain. You know, the black community has been absolutely essential to working class left politics in this country. And to claim that you're reuniting a multiracial coalition and then seemingly somehow forget that black people exist, that on that kind of, you know, just raw identity level, that was really disappointing for me.
Yeah, I think it's probably reflective of I think some of the people behind that slate have, which is that they want to, you know, build on this. What's the pejorative French term? I can never pronounce it. Islamo-gauchist, or how do you say? Is that how you say it? Islamo-gauchist. So the idea that there's this, and this is used in a critical way by, you know, right-wing people to criticise the left in France. But this idea that through anti-imperialism, there's a convergence between like the left and Islam in various ways. And, you know, obviously, most Muslims in this country tend to be South Asian, not black, not uniformly. But it's a terrible oversight. I completely agree. It's probably to a certain extent an expression of their strategy as well, which I think is very reasonable to disagree with. I think on a zoomed out level, I'm going to get all cultural studies on you, and I've been talking to Jeremy Gilbert a lot recently, so you know, I'm gonna get all cultural studies on you. I just do think that in politics, affect and vibe are incredibly important.
Yeah,
like far more important than the details of basically anything. Starmer's a great example in this. I'm not sure if I've said this on the podcast before, but it's interesting that actually Starmer has done some stuff in government that if Burnham had done it or if Jeremy Corbyn had done it, we'd actually be like, oh, this is great. You know, like pay rises public sector, let out a lot of prisoners, actually, straight away. Like, he's actually done some good stuff. The problem is the affect and vibe around Starmer, and the story that he always tried to tell about himself, is one of being anti-left. And he's always been portrayed as such. He'll always be understood as such. That's the feeling around him. So this stuff's just not congruent with that feeling, and thus it doesn't get understood in that way or reported in that way. And it just cannot be denied that the affect and the vibe around your party at the moment is terrible. It's just terrible. I want to try and engage with it, and ideologically, I obviously support the project, and I see the need for a socialist organisation in the UK. Whether or not the Green Party is doing really well, I see the need for a socialist organisation in the UK. But I really struggle, because from the leadership down, and you're now seeing this, as you say, with people from various slates taking chunks out of each other who actually aren't part of the leadership of the party. You can't blame that on Zara and Jeremy. It's people who are members of the party. The culture and the vibe is just pretty rancid. And I don't know, it sounds like a fluffy, woolly thing, but I'm very open to hearing ideas as to how that can be changed. Because I do wonder if that's just a bit set and it might be a little bit irrevocable now.
I mean, I genuinely struggle to see at a national level how it is shifted now. I think part of the problem here is that you have, a bunch of people at the top, and also the kind of more subaltern cultures of your party generally, people who have kind of really cleaved to quite dogmatically to either one side, who are not treating politics as a pedagogical experience and a way of bringing people in and a way of trying to construct a vibe and an affect, right? So if you look at Zach Polanski and you look at Hannah Spencer, for example, they're building a vibe, but there's one crucial thing that happens when they build that vibe. They talk about their political development. Like if you watch for example, on Bold Politics, Zach Polanski and Hannah Spencer had a conversation about their respective political developments, right? Zach's talking about the Lib Dems, Hannah Spencer is talking about all the kind of successive approximations that made her join the Green Party, become a leftist, etc. And someone like Zara Sultana, for example, doesn't do that, Like she's been out in the Labour Party for less than a year, but acts as if he's been the most radical person on the left for quite some time. And that's a bad political culture to have. Like, you need to have a political culture that tries to draw people in. And, I have heard of and been a part of building local political cultures around this Your Party thing, where we have really tried to do that and have had some success, but it is always obstructed by what happens above and by the kind of culture and the politics from above. So the thing that I wrestle with this Your Party situation that they've got themselves in, this kind of culture of competition, the bad faith vibes that they've inherited from the Labour Party and from the bitter feuds that went on over the years, that won't be able to sustain this party going forward. The people will get demoralized, like people already have. They'll disengage. Some are threatening to walk away. Like, none of this bodes well. And look, for me, I'm just really honest and open. And I'm open and honest about this locally as well as on this pod. I want to think about what we can rescue locally. I would like Your Party to work nationally, but none of the people. Well, let me caveat that there are people involved. There are people I know on both slates, and there are people I know on neither slate who could take this party in a good direction and build a better political culture. But there are people at the centre of each and who have legions of supporters who will not do that and who will willingly obstructing the possibility of building a meaningful culture and a meaningful organisation.
Yeah, Jonas, so I can really hear the frustration in your voice, and I think I share that, and I think everyone listening will share that frustration as well. The Labour Party are in the biggest crisis that they've faced in the last decade or more, possibly even in the Labour Party's entire history. Yeah. Bigger crises even than some of the Tories' crises that plagued various different iterations of the Tory government. We've got the Epstein files and, the just reality of these disgusting elite men who have abused and exploited working class women. We have that crisis ricocheting across the entire elite establishment and just exposing the moral rot at the heart of liberalism. On top of that, we've got today Palestine Action's prescription being found to be unlawful. We've got the Filton activists. There were varying degrees of kind of the findings in those cases, but overall it was an absolute disaster for the government. So we've got multiplying crises for the government. And in the heat of this, your party and the many and the grassroots slate are completely viewing things entirely through factional lenses. So I will mention a comrade, and I think the first thing to say is that this comrade has experienced really horrific bullying online, and we absolutely have to reject and call that out. But there was an interesting interaction online between Max Shanley and he quote tweeted Jeremy Corbyn, and it was about Jeremy Corbyn meeting Chris Smalls. So Chris Smalls was a union leader of Amazon workers in the US, and he founded a really fantastic trade union. But a couple of years ago, there was a real conflict between him and some of the rank and file members. The rank and file members believed that he had a bit of an undemocratic, in fact, quite a lot of an undemocratic leadership style and quite a kind of tyrannical approach to leading the union, and his faction was eventually voted out. But Max quote tweets Jeremy saying, "Isn't it awful and unprincipled that Jeremy is meeting with Chris?" Meanwhile, Zara Sultana posted a picture of her and Chris Smalls just last summer, after all of the stuff had played out in the Amazon Workers Union, showing support for Chris Smalls, who'd been abducted and assaulted by Israeli forces. There was nothing to say at that point. You know, there's no critique of Zara for showing support for Chris Smalls in that circumstance. And yet there is for Jeremy Corbyn. And I just think, you know, the grassroots left slate pride themselves and boast about being politically principled. And I think actually the reality is in many cases we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing principles filtered through factionalism and manoeuvring, and in a context where Labour are in the biggest crisis they've possibly ever been in, it's just unforgivable.
Well, look at the Gorton and Denton by-election, right? We talked about this in the last episode. Like within a couple of days, like you've got the various factions of your party putting out statements. The grassroots left one was the most embarrassing that came out, because all of the most popular signatories of the grassroots left came out and put a statement very different to what was released. But they put out a statement about Gorton and Denton that starts from the question of the factional struggles within your party. It doesn't start from the question that there is a battle against the far right that needs to be run. And what are you going to do to contribute that? How are you going to mobilise forces to contribute towards that? And I think like the political moment thing is really important that you've both raised, because as well as, you know, that point about Keir Starmer, and he can do, like he has done in bits and bobs, some good things like raising wages for public sector workers. There's also a question there about the Overton window, right? Which is how much has the Overton window shifted in crisis times, so that when someone like Keir Starmer does something, it doesn't actually go down well, because people have higher expectations, because people want more, because their lives are worse, because the crisis politics are deeper. And the fact that you have people in your party who are just not willing to take advantage of that and think about that moment that we're in and start from that premise rather than the premise that they are starting, it's just incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm hesitant to use the word endemic when describing the factionalism, because that does make it sound like there's no coming back from it. But you know, the disregard for the truth and political consistency, frankly, is really worrying. And I'm going to quote from, you know, a frankly quite brilliant piece written by a guy called Sam Joyce this week on his new Substack they launched just a couple of days ago. I don't know who Sam Joyce is, never met him, never met them. But they basically write this, like, I would say, like, very forensic takedown of Zara. And I don't use forensic in a piss-taking way. I mean forensic. It's actually forensic. Now, don't get me wrong. I assume this person probably has something to do with the For the Many slate, because it's very anti-Zara and it comes during the CEC election. So I obviously want to offer it with that caveat. But, you know, this guy's gathered the receipts in a way that, frankly, I feel like I should have done, or we should have done. Yeah. Like, I read this and I was like, God, I wish I'd written this. Insofar as, you know, he's gone back and looked at what Zara said while she was in the Labour Party. And obviously Zara, you know, criticised Corbyn for signing up to the IHRA during his leadership of the Labour Party. Everything that we can find suggests that she also signed up to the IHRA without complaint. Yeah. She did that in that political moment, you know. She distinguishes herself from Corbyn and Corbyn's faction by being, quote unquote, avowedly anti-Zionist. But then, you know, when she was in the Labour Party in, I think it was like 2017 or 2018, she got attacked on the basis of anti-Semitism, which happens to a lot of left-wing people. And she released a statement in 2019 election saying, "I accept Labour's position of pursuing a two-state solution. For many Jewish people, Zionism represents Jewish people's right to a nation-state, a right to safety after the Holocaust and centuries of oppression and persecution preceding it." Now, look, I'm the first to sympathise with people taking pragmatic stances on certain issues in moments of intensity and moments of like heightened struggle. Like I can totally understand why people ended up compromising on certain things in certain moments. The problem I have with this is that Zara's just not honest about this. Zara acts, as you guys have just said, as if she's always been this avowed radical who's held these positions unequivocally and without, in her words, giving an inch, you know, for her entire political career. Whereas she clearly gave an inch because, you know, the avowed anti-Zionist literally 7 years ago said she understands why for many Jewish people Zionism is really important. And I just think this is like absurd, childish politics, to be honest. And it's yeah, it's just crap. It's really crap.
I have a question that I want to raise about Zara's maybe strategic approach to the leadership tussles in your party. We've spoken a lot on this podcast about Carrie Murphy and her influence on kind of Jeremy Corbyn's politics and positioning and inner circle. We've spoken less about Craig Lloyd, who's Zara Sultana's husband. And I don't know much about this guy, truthfully, but what I hear is not great in terms of his influence on Zara's inner circle, bearing in mind, just like Carrie Murphy, this is someone who's got a history in trade union bureaucracy, you know, isn't an elected leader in any sense of the word within your party, but seems to exert quite a significant influence on everything that's playing out. And I think we have to call that out, as well as, you know, calling out characters like Carrie Murphy.
I think if we want to think seriously about the relationship between bureaucracy and politics, and we want to think about maneuvers behind the scenes that have debilitated the process of party formation, we want to think about the kind of construction of really unhealthy political cultures. And if we want to think about how sectarianism and personal animosity has dominated so much of this process of party formation, then it is just genuinely quite hypocritical to just focus on the advisor, the kind of organizer, the centrifugal bureaucratic figure from one side of the party.
Exactly.
Right? Like there is another figure, Shanice has mentioned him, who has engaged in all of these maneuvers. And I think it would be dishonest to not engage with that kind of history and trajectory. That there are just, you know, it's not a conspiracy theory. Like, there are just people who have kind of acted brazenly behind the scenes and unintentionally, I'm sure, but demonstratively worked to hinder and potentially kill this party from the offset. I'm not going to say this party is dead yet. I think the CEC elections will be a test. I think we'll see what happens over the next months, what the relationship is between the CEC and the branches. But we can't sit here with good faith and say, if Carrie from Scotland has produced all of these problems, and then just insert into the leadership and organizational structure Craig from London, that will just have a solution, and that similar problems won't be reproduced in the organization. They will be reproduced. And so, like, you know, there are these big question marks basically over the future of the organization. And that's why I'm insistent that there are good people from each slate, and there are good independents. I want those people to win this CE selection. I don't want the kind of core of each to win.
I do have to disagree with you on one point that you mentioned earlier, though, and I don't see any good options really with the CEC elections. But isn't the danger of one side not winning that you institutionalise the split in the organisation? You have, you know, if you've got, say, let's say 50-50 on each side of grassroots left slate and the many slate on the CEC, you've got decisions that can't be made, you've got impasse where people are just wrangling and rowing. You know, the risk of it being evenly split is that the organisation isn't able to move forward. The risk of one of them winning is that, you know, candidates have already pledged and been briefing in the media that if one slate or the other wins, they're either going to leave or they're going to continue the factionalism. You know, I heard one candidate on the grassroots left slate say that if the many wins, then that would be awful, terrible news, and we'd have to continue the struggle for party democracy. And that's actually just a code for saying we'll have to continue the faction fights. And, you know, I guess the flip side of the context of Labour being in crisis is Greens elevating constantly. And
Greens.
yeah, I mean, good vibes Greens. Yeah. Who thought like 2 years ago would be sat here as Marxists and socialists being like, yeah, the Greens is where the vibes are at. But the Greens have possibly passively, but certainly practically benefited from the crises in your party, both in terms of membership, in terms of legitimacy, in terms of media monopolization, in terms of, you know, holding the narrative in certain political debates. And the more this goes on, the more these, you know, increasingly insignificant characters who, you know, postulate online run your party, I think the more the Greens are going to be able to monopolise on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a marker of bad political culture when people's spouses are just totally involved with their politics, and when there are meetings, and I think these meetings have been reported, I don't know, but, you know, when there are meetings between Zara and Craig on one side, and then Jeremy and Laura being Jeremy's wife on the other. This is just like a deeply amateur political culture. Yeah. It's almost weirdly like mafiosa. Like I just think that it's very important for when you're doing high level political work to have a very supportive partner, a partner that can understand, but to have a partner that completely inserts themselves into it in this way is just like really unhealthy, and it mixes the personal and political in a way which I actually just think is very bad for the organisations that those people are a part of. I mean, I wouldn't want to attribute that dynamic. I wouldn't want to attribute everything that's gone wrong with your party to that dynamic, but I definitely think it's there for sure. And yeah, look, Craig from London does not talk to me anymore because Craig from London was very unhappy, shall we say, when in the first few episodes of this podcast we were mildly critical of Zara, and
very mildly
critical of Zara. And you know, there are many other things I could say that I won't say, and many crazy messages that I could read out that I won't, because it just becomes a bit gossip mongering, you know what I mean? But I do think you guys are right. Like, Carrie from Scotland has had a lot of heat, and it is important to say that there are other figures behind the scenes that are doing equally mad shit.
That for me is just pure bad vibes, though. Like, if you tout yourself as a political leader and you are unable to take even mild critique, you don't see, for example, that critique leads to growth. You know, critique isn't about you've got it wrong, you know, we're going to stamp on you, you're out, you're exiled, you're excluded. Critique is about kind of getting our analysis right, making sure our leadership's on point, making sure our comms are hitting the messages that they need to hit. Why? Because politics isn't about power, it isn't about ego, it's not about having fun and vibes. People's lives are at stake. There's a fucking genocide in Gaza, there's a cost of living crisis across the West. People are suffering. That is why we do this. And like, if someone says to you, you've got something wrong, when the stakes are so high, you should be able to be like, yeah, do you know what? I see that, you know, this thing that we're doing, this fight that we're fighting is bigger than me and I want to get it right. So let's try and get it right collectively together. I feel our political culture is so, it's deteriorated so much, where everything is personal, critique is personal, debate is personal, disagreements are personal, not political. And that's a massive problem.
I think there's something I want to pick on what you just said, which is useful to unpack a bit further. The phrase bigger than you. I worry that there are people right at the heart of this who are not thinking about things bigger than themselves, frankly. And when you're not thinking like that, it's going to bake in the factionalism, it's going to bake in the animosity, it's going to bake in the fragility. Just to kind of come back to you, Shanice, on what you said prior, yes, ultimately, there is a deep potential that if there is a relatively equitable distribution of votes amongst the different slates, that it will institutionalize the culture even further. But there is also a chance that, independents will get elected onto the CEC.
I beg.
Who can stymie and mediate and nullify some of this bad vibes and take the edge off it, because the edge needs taken off. Because I just don't think any of these people meaningfully realise that if this dies, they will be the ones who have killed it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Spent a bit longer on that, didn't we?
Yo, man, I'm pissed, man. We're just chatting bare shit, man. So, actually, not unrelated to all of this is party formation and structure. And there's been a lot of kind of talks of, what kind of socialist organisation and formation do we need in this moment? So Joe is going to take us through his hot take about the Belgian Workers' Party and the Democratic Socialists of America.
Yeah, so I finally get to talk about my hobby horse, which is the Democratic Socialists of America and the Belgian Workers' Party. But we are talking about them for good reason. And look, the hot take is that these two organisations, Democratic Socialists of America and the Belgian Workers' Party, are not the same. They're just not the same. And that might seem like an obvious thing to say, but I think once we contextualise it, you'll kind of see why I'm saying it. So I think we're talking about these two organisations for two very good reasons. One reason is that they've been the most commonly cited reference point during all of the conversations with regards to how can we change the Green Party into a socialist party, or how can we build your party into a successful socialist party. These, for various reasons, they were at TWT a lot. There's quite strong links to the Belgian Workers' Party through the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. But like these two parties have been cited a lot. And it's correct to cite them a lot in many ways, because there are lessons to learn there, and they have been very successful organisations. Like, the DSA has just passed 100,000 members, and they obviously got Zoran Mamdani elected along with a ton of other socialist representatives at different levels of state. And, it's likely that a DSA-endorsed candidate, AOC, will run for the president at the next election. So they're like a serious, successful, but still avowedly socialist organisation. The Belgian Workers' Party, who are not just an avowedly socialist organisation, but a self-identifying Marxist organisation, are currently at 21% in the polls in Belgium. So that's just 3 points behind the two leading parties. And they have 28,000 members, which, if you adjust for population, is the equivalent of having a 165,000 member organisation in the UK. So that's like an avowedly Marxist party at 21% in the polls with 165,000 members. Like if we were there in the UK, we'd be like, whoa, we're doing well. So it's, these are two good organisations to look at. And I do think the method of looking at what organisations have achieved in other countries and how they're structured and what their cultures are like is really good for us when we're looking at trying to form and build a party. Like looking at these real world lived examples is like very, very good for us. So it's, I'm really glad that people are talking about them and that it's happening. I think my problem is that they've often been talked about with not a very high degree of understanding and specificity. And they've often been talked about in tandem. So it's like, we want to, be more like the Democratic Socialists of America and more like the Belgian Workers' Party. And my take is that just these two organizations are wildly different in terms of context, in terms of structure, in terms of history, in terms of culture. And they're both very successful in their own context, but just wildly different. And yeah, I'm going to use this take to basically just like run you through the differences. And I think, we'll start with the origins. So, the Belgian Workers' Party was founded in 1979 as a very small Maoist cadre organisation. So this was a group of Maoist students who would go and try and work in the ports of Antwerp and try and, organise port workers at a kind of rank and file level. One of the party people that I talked to described the party in that moment as a little party with a very big head, which I loved. And I think what they were saying there is
sounds like me.
Yeah, which is what I was saying. I think what they were saying there is that like there really weren't many of them, and they talked a lot about what was the right position on XYZ issue, but actually weren't particularly effective in the country and didn't really change much. They existed like this for an incredibly long time, and they were just this, like small sect basically that weren't particularly impactful. And their moment of change was 2008. So they had a Congress in 2008, which they called the Congress of Renewal. And they basically completely changed the structure and the orientation of the party. They, instead of just being a cadre organization with, like a very strong militant core that were very dedicated to the organization and gave lots of money and all of their time, they opened up to Belgium in a way where they allowed supporters to come in and, be a member for €5 a year. They had a lower level of membership where you could just turn up to the local group and do stuff, but you didn't have to dedicate your whole life to the party. And they also changed how they spoke, and they adopted a more populist register, more in keeping with Syriza or Podemos or Corbynism to a certain extent, where instead of just waving the red flag in someone's face, you would talk about the material issues that the working class faced at that time, and you talk in broader terms of the people. And, this strategic opening for them seems to have really worked in the sense that they have, in intervening years, recruited loads more members, surged in the polls, and are becoming a real force in Belgium. But I think the thing that needs to be emphasized is that they have these two things, this broader front and this broader layer, but they also have this dedicated, ideologically coherent cadre in the middle who have been with them for a very, very long time. So I think that's the big thing to understand about the PTB in their context. The DSA actually set up at similar times in 1982, a merger of a couple of organizations back then, but it was never set up as an ideologically coherent organization. It wasn't a Maoist or a Trotskyist organization or whatever. It was an anti-Stalinist organization, actually. So it was like the broad left, but not the kind of like authoritarian Stalinist left. And it was always set up not as a political party, but as a socialist organization. So they might, run candidates as independents or run on the Democratic ballot line, but it was always set up as like this broad socialist organization. There's a similarity in the sense that the DSA really wasn't a factor in American politics for a very long time and was, a tiny organization. It was different from the PTB, and they didn't have this opening up moment where they changed their structures. The structures were always quite open. But what happened was Bernie Sanders. And, Bernie Sanders ran in 2015, and he ran as a democratic socialist. And so many people got involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And then afterwards, and this is literally how it happened, like you talk to insiders in the DSA and they say this, people just Googled Democratic Socialist America. And then because the DSA was called the Democratic Socialists of America, they came up the top of Google, and then everyone joined.
Wow, contingency.
Crazy contingency.
Do you think anyone's going to be Googling my party and then your party comes up?
I don't know, man. I don't know. But it's like crazy contingency. And this is like, it sounds like a stupid kind of like anecdote or whatever, but it is actually what people say inside the organization. And, and since 2016, the organization has grown, I think something like, oh God, I have the statistics somewhere in the report, but I think it's something like 98% of the members have joined since 2016. So it's just completely recomposed it. And it was basically loads of millennials just like flow into this organization. So like, these are these two kind of like specific histories. And I think it's just worth pointing out that they're just very, very, very specific to their context, in that like the DSA would have never erupted if it weren't for Bernie Sanders, and the PTB would have never built the kind of structure that it has if it hadn't got that like strong cadre in the middle. But just that like they've resulted in organizations that are wildly different, like wildly different. And there are so many ways in which I could talk about this. I think the main axes in which I'll talk about it is decentralization versus centralization. So the PTB in Belgium is an incredibly centralized organization. It has a very strong leadership that have been there for a long time, that are very close to the cadres within it. And they really do just like dictate the party line, They practice what they call democratic centralism, which is where they, internally will have debates about what the party should do and say or whatever. But then once the line's been decided, you cannot disagree publicly if you're a PTB member. That is not allowed. And, you'll get a talking to if you disagree publicly, or if you like contravene the party line. If you do it enough, you'll be kicked out. On the other hand, the DSA is wildly decentralized. And this is in part a reflection of the country that it's in. It's in a massive country, which almost demands decentralization and obviously operates within a federal political system. But it means that there is basically no leadership, as in that there is technically an elected leadership, but the National Political Committee, which is their elected leadership, has very little power to actually make anything happen on a national level. And really all of the action in the DSA is happening at the branch level, and is happening within the caucuses, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, like to say we want to be structured like the DSA and the PTB is a crazy thing to say, because one is wildly centralized with like a lot of top-down power, and one is wildly decentralized with lots of power located across the organization. The second thing is democracy. Like, obviously a lot of the battle within your party was around, can we make this thing democratic? And the PTB and the DSA were cited as these organizations that were democratic. They were like left-wing organizations that had internal democracy. But I can't even describe to you how different the democracy is in both of these organizations. Again, in the PTB, it's this very centralist approach where the people who are the militants, who are the core of the organization, who have been essentially invited to become one of those people who dedicated their lives to it, they, along with the leadership cadre, who have been the leadership for many, many years, decide the direction of the party. It's not this big open thing. The DSA is wildly open, and they kind of describe it as a voluntocracy. Like if you turn up and you want to like get stuck in and get involved in the DSA, you're probably going to have quite a lot of power quite quickly just through action. But at the same time, you can characterize it as a deeply undemocratic organization because the groups in the organization that have the power really are the caucuses, these ideological caucuses. I think there's 12 or 13 of them. 12 who actually represent a tiny proportion of the membership, but exert such influence over the organization because they're the only groups that are really organizing cross-chapter, like nationally, and cohering people in that way, because the center of the organization and the leadership of the organization is so weak. So again, like, if you're a PTB member, a DSA member, you can argue that your organization is democratic, and you can make that argument, but they're wildly different forms of democracy, like wildly different forms of democracy. And forms of democracy that are very much influenced by their context, either this, having been a Maoist cadre organization and having that history, and actually being in a very small country where a centralized party makes sense. Belgium's 10 million people. Or being this like big, open, broad front organization, which the DSA is, in this massive country where there has to be decentralization, really, because it's just so big. And it really is just like 52 countries in one. So yeah, there's so much more I could say, but like those are two ways in which they're very different. You may be asking the question, why are we talking about them at all then? That would be a good question to ask. And I think we're talking about them because I do think there are some things we can learn. And I really want to caveat this with like, neither of these organizations can be copy and pasted into our context. I think the way they've been talked about is as if we can just set up a UK DSA and it'll be fine or whatever. And I don't think that's possible. Not think in those terms, but I do think we can take inspiration from certain elements of both organizations. And I think the three that I would point to is that I find the local group structure of the PTB very interesting. The local groups in the PTB are limited to 8 to 12 people. If you're a member of a local group, you have to turn up to every meeting. The point is that you build consistent and ongoing relationships with a small number of people at the hyper-local level. Those relationships are really important. You can't just drift in and drift out. This is like a real commitment that you make. And actually they ensure this by collecting membership dues at meetings. So you are only a member in good standing if you go to the meeting and you pay your money. And this is obviously wildly different to the default conception that we often have of local groups, where it's, it's for a constituency or it's for a borough. Anybody can turn up, anybody can get involved. It's quite like loosey-goosey and there's no real commitment there. And I suspect that like how we approach local groups in this country just doesn't work that well, actually, and they're really hard to make work well. So I think looking at these kind of like smaller, more focused models that the PTB are pushing, very interesting. I'd say looking at the DSA, I think one of the things that we can learn and take inspiration from there is their sense of voluntocracy. Like there's such a strong culture and expectation in the organization that no one's going to do anything for you. Like if you want to take the organization in a direction by getting your branch to really focus on worker organizing, say, or to get a load of DSA candidates elected, you're going to have to do that, and you're going to have to find a load of people to do that with you. And I actually think that is an incredibly strong quality which has made the DSA both very powerful beyond its financial means and beyond its staff capacity, but it's also built up just a cadre of like actually very competent and skilled and intellectually interesting and strategic activists, because they've had to do stuff and make decisions and make mistakes. So there's lots of other stuff that I could say, but like I think those are just two ways in which I say we can learn from these two organizations. And if you want to hear more, you should read the report, which will be which will be in the notes of the show.
So, hi, my name's Shanice McBean, and I'm an expert in the PTB and DSA because I have read Joe Todd's report. So, and what my expert reflection is...
Joe is so red right
I was red before. There's a whole room. I don't get embarrassed.
I think one of the things that I like about the PTB, the Belgian Workers' Party, is their message discipline. You know, once they decide a line, an analysis, an orientation, you know, through discussion and debate and then ultimately a vote, they stick with that position and they stick with that line. And obviously you multiply the power of your message by so many more times if everyone is banging the same drum. I guess the pitfall is that message discipline comes as a direct result of their democratic centralist style of organising, which is a classical Marxist-Leninist approach to party form and structure. And, you know, the reality is democratic centralism in Britain has a completely bad rap, in no small part thanks to the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP, and the fact that it was democratic centralism, you know, this very centralised leadership structure that outside of conference floors is quite impenetrable and quite difficult to influence. And it was that structure that was at the heart of their rape and sexual assault, you know, case where they completely let down women. And then not only did they let down those women, when people tried to rebel and tried to raise it and tried to discuss it, they used those democratic centralist structures to kind of crush that dissent. And, you know, ever since then, probably even before then, but ever since then, you know, democratic centralism has had a pretty terrible reputation in this country. So it's hard to imagine how we can achieve that sort of message discipline in our context with our movement history. I then look at the Democratic Socialists of America, and it reminds me of that really powerful article from kind of feminist theory, actually, called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. There's this idea that if you have fewer structures, then you have less centralization, and less centralization means less power is exerted on you, and you're able to be your full democratic subject because there isn't structure to kind of oppress you and hold you down. The reality is, when you don't have structure, informal structures form organically, typically off the back of social groups or kind of, you know, other forms of power formation, whether that's someone has a particularly charismatic and influential personality type. And that kind of structure, I think, would lend itself so terribly to the existing political culture that we have in this country, where political debate is reduced to either you're cowering under the idea that you can't have a debate because everyone's too pure, accusations of purity, or debate descends into kind of who's most righteous and who's got the bigger ego and whoever does will prevail. And I think our kind of culture of debate going in tandem with a structureless organisation is just a recipe for disaster if your party isn't already showing that, you know, structurelessness is a disaster. So I think that there is maybe something to learn from the Greens, and I think that actually maybe this raises some quite interesting questions around the CEC elections, which we just discussed. But the Greens have managed to achieve some level of message discipline. Number one, because they've had the debates already. So, for example, they've had debates on Palestine, they've had debates on trans solidarity, they hashed those out, they were quite raucous. Some people either left the party or were booted out, but they resolved that. But then they've also been able to cohere behind a charismatic leader. And they've been able to achieve kind of consent amongst the members in the party behind Zach Polansky. You know, he got 85% of the vote to be leader on an incredibly high turnout of nearly 40%, which is one of their highest turnouts in any of their leadership elections. So maybe there's a model there. Maybe what we need is some kind of hybrid whereby we have these debates, we hash them out, we agree a position, and then we're able to unite behind that, behind a leader that we trust, behind a leader that can really communicate to people, behind a leader that is fundamentally likable. That doesn't mean that we then kind of in a kind of democratically centralist fashion just fall behind the line and don't, publicly critique. And that doesn't happen in the Green Party. There are public debates, there are public discussions and rows. Just recently, a comrade left the Green Party due to accusations of a racist internal culture in some branches in London. So, these debates still happen, but there is a consistency that can occur behind a leader that you actually like. And I think that's where maybe in your party, and again, you can't just, magic these things up from out the ether, but there's this serious question of how we create new generations of leadership, how we create vibrant, charismatic, knowledgeable, relatable, likable leaders that used to exist and exude in Jeremy Corbyn, but I'd say he's probably tarnished his reputation in many ways by how he's behaved over the past 12 months, and similarly with Zara Sultana. I go back to our first episode. We need new leaders.
Look, I just want to start off and say, well done on putting this out there. I really hope it gets as many outputs as possible because it's just really rich, especially like for a report, right? Reports are notoriously boring, and this is just like really, it's quite easy to read. And I think one of the things that I find kind of, it feels like you're getting job interview feedback now. I think one of the things that I find kind of strikingly refreshing is the way that you're trying to think carefully and honestly about one of the central strategic questions which confronts our side. How do you concretely think about the issue of organisation in specific conditions and contexts without adherence to like a formula, basically? And, just as anecdotally, it was really noticeable at the World Transformed last year, like seeing like Peter Mertens, the leader of the PTB or the spokesperson of the PTB, strut around and speak on platforms with like all of these like young Marxists kind of falling all over him because he was just like...
He's a proper celeb, man.
Just obviously more serious than what we have in this country without kind of like romanticising any of the challenges and problems that exist. There's a point that kind of Shanice is alluding to, that leaders can mediate, they can aggregate, they can condense.
Exactly.
And, your party currently is just incapable of really doing that, particularly the two figures that lead it. So I've got a bunch of small questions that I want to ask you. The first one is, so in the report, if I remember correctly, you talk about like the kind of big democratic conference process happens every 5 years in the Belgian Workers' Party, right? How deliberative is that? Like, how involving of members is that? Like, because obviously, Shanice has kind of alluded to the democratic centralist bit of it, and in Britain, there's always been a much more impetus put on the centralist bit.
Yep.
But yeah, like what do we know about that? Like, how democratic is it? I guess.
Yeah, it's about. I think it is relatively deliberative in the sense that I think the militant layer in the centre. So just to be really explicit, there are 3 layers of membership in the PTB. There is the supporter layer, who they have no obligations. They just pay €5 a year and they get the magazine. There's the base group member layer, who they pay more, but it's like normal dues, and they have to come to meetings and maybe do like a couple of hours of party work every month. And then there's the militant layer, and the militant layer basically give their life to the party. They donate all of their income above 21,000 euros for quote unquote like intellectuals, white collar workers, and above 23,000 euros for blue collar workers. And they give a ton of time to the party, and it's their life, right? Those people have loads of power over the congressional process, and some of the base group members do too. But the thing is, I think they form consensus in the PTB not through coercion so much. It's not like I don't think loads of people are always getting like excluded or kicked out or whatever because they disagree with the party line. It's that they select for people at every stage of the organisation who are going to agree with both the democratic centralist culture and the general direction of the organisation as well. So if you make it to the militant layer, you're probably not going to have massive disagreements with the leadership and other people who are in the militant layer. And they're quite open about that. They're just like, look, like people that agree with the direction of the organisation and how it works end up in the militant layer. Other people were a bit like, well, it's not really for you. So yeah, it's deliberative, but it is not open. It's like it's that core of the party who are really actually able to engage with it. And I just wanted to come back to Shanice's point on leadership. Like, I think you're totally right. Like, the cohering power of a leader and a figurehead is a huge thing, and it's really important, and is increasingly important, I think, in a heavily mediatized environment and politics, where like image and representation is like a really big deal. And it's the thing that the DSA really, really struggle with, is that they don't have these big, cohering leaders that can kind of iron out the contradictions and soften all that, and then condense the thinking and the analysis and the feeling of the organization and express it in a national way. They don't have that. The closest they have to that are high-profile candidates who they've endorsed, but who then they don't actually have much control over. And this has led to lots of bust-ups between, say, AOC, who was never a DSA person but was endorsed by DSA, and the organisation, because then, AOC's position on Israel and various other things has been in direct contradiction with what the organisation wants. So yeah, I think that leadership piece is a real missing piece for the DSA. They might well never have, just because of how power is distributed across the organisation.
Yeah, and like another question I have is, when you're talking about like local groups and neighbourhood scale, and you said 8 to 12 people in a local group, right? And I just thinking to myself, like, in just my ward, if we had 8 to 12 people that could do work, that could organise, like, it would just be a game changer, basically. And there was a bit of that, the Your Party thing promised that, right? That when you look at the breakdown of the figures and all of that sort of stuff of people who were signing up, that was real, like more than 8 to 12 people actually. But I guess, there's taken into account like the kind of breakdown in different types of engagement and different types of membership with PTB, that would have been different. But one question I have is, like, how large are these neighborhood scales? Like, what constitutes a neighborhood? It's a smaller country, but like, how many people does that kind of represent?
I actually don't know. I don't know. I mean, I could make something up if you want. I don't know.
Yeah, I think for me there's something quite attractive about the DSA's structurelessness, even though I just kind of critiqued it in relation to our context, but in the sense that actually it's something that makes the central apparatus of your party weaker. It's maybe a good thing. I'm quite attracted to the idea of caucuses from the perspective of political education, because, the PTB functions on quite kind of like a tight prospectus because it's able to inoculate a particular style of kind of Marxist organising, Marxist theorising, an understanding of history and analysis of the political economy, etc. And I do wonder, with the kind of political culture we have, where their primary place to hash out debates is online, I do wonder if actually it would be a step forward for these debates to be hosted in more caucus structures, where people are kind of meeting regularly with comrades that agree with them, producing position papers, hosting webinars online. It's a bit what I praised in an earlier episode about some of the organising that took place in the early months of Your Party, where, for example, the Democratic Socialists were... Are they called Democratic Socialists? Demsoc. Yeah, they are. I'm getting all the D's and the S's all confused. But where they were hosting debates and, they were writing position papers and people could engage with that in a constructive way. I wonder if, wrapping some of our political culture up in these loose structures, although it might not be where we want to end up ultimately, might be a step forward from where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the big questions, because it does look like that's a trajectory that Your Party could go on, right? Oh, I have so many thoughts. I mean, like, people inside the DSA are very negative about the caucuses. It's worth saying. Like, they, some people describe them as cartels.
Yeah.
They describe them as these organizations that, although they often start with a certain ideological coherence, actually they often lose that ideological coherence, and they persist because they become networks through which you can control the DSA at a national level, right? And I think that patronage networks, not unlike the patronage networks that you see control the Labour Party behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I think that is a thing that we've got to be wary of. I think another thing we've got to be wary of is that they encourage ideological differentiation and kind of like difference seeking. So it's like, oh, I am this specific brand of, Marxist Leninist,
becomes an identity
whatever.
Almost.
Yeah. And it's like, so I am in this caucus, and but I think that Lenin should have done this in this year, so I'm in this caucus. And you know what I mean? And it does kind of not to be too pejorative, but it does really kind of encourage and empower the bedroom Marxist vibe. You know what I mean? Which is not my politics, and not a politics and a vibe that I think can build.
Wait, hang on though. But which of you is the one that's got the bust of Gramsci in their bathroom? Because
I have a little picture of Gramsci in my bathroom, but that's not my bedroom. That's my bathroom. So it's a completely different. So it's a completely different thing. It's a completely different thing. Completely different thing. That said, I would say that the caucuses. The problem with the caucuses is that the DSA has some level of centralisation. Like, it's not completely decentralised insofar as it does have a national political committee, it has a national staff, and they have, national conventions. So it's not like this completely decentralised organisation. I think in a completely decentralised organisation, caucuses are potentially really productive and cool. And then, as you say, they do have this kind of like intellectual output, which like pushes people. And I do think that is really good. I think it's just gonna struggle. They'll just kind of turn into factions rather than caucuses in a more centralised organisation when there's power to seize in the middle. And I think that's even a problem in the DSA, but would be really a massive problem in a political party that was trying itself to contest elections, because political parties necessitate a certain amount of centralisation. So yeah, like I write a lot more about it in the report, but I have this kind of terrible fear of them, but then I also look at some of the kind of like incredibly high levels of engagement that they've produced and find that very impressive. Yeah. So yeah, it's this real ambivalence, I think.
Each structure has their own positives and negatives. And I guess, as you rightly said, it's not about plucking an organisational form out of its context and being like, wouldn't this be great here? It's about understanding and analysing where we're at, where our people are at, and what we need, and starting from there.
In the report, like, you make the point that DSA tends to be more experimental, less coherent, and looser. I just wonder, like, with all the different caucuses and platforms in DSA, like, what are the areas of organising, electioneering, campaigning, where you get the impression that there tends to be a collaborative approach? Like, where, there's some like level of synthesis, but then also where are the areas where there's a divergence? I think you talk in the report about the difference between, say, NYC DSA, which is run more by the right of the party and is stronger on the electoral front, and then East Bay DSA, which is run by the Communist Caucus and does a lot more, say, tenants union organising. Because I guess, like, thinking hypothetically about the national movement against ICE, against the immigration and customs enforcement squads that Trump is rolling out across the country. And the idea that there's like probably some real benefit for the organisation having a Marxist wing that kind of stresses action on the streets and like a more reformist inclined wing. Obviously, these are all both kind of cliches, but that stresses action within the state. But at the same time, that may also cause significant tension when one is, when those organizations find themselves in quite different contexts and quite different spaces where they feel quite different pressures, and creates the situation where there's ruptures and schisms that maybe the organization can't hold, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I think it's worth saying that I actually don't detect a lot of political disagreement across the organization when it comes to issues. Like, I think most people across the DSA would say that, Palestine is really important. Resisting ICE is really important. Cost of living is really important. Like, it's not like people would have political disagreements as to what the important issues are. I think it is very much differences around theories of change, theories of socialist transition, theories of revolution. Frankly, like, that's, and it is an organization that has essentially left social democrats to revolutionaries in, and that's not an easy organisation always to keep together. Some of these disagreements are expressed at the level of the National Political Committee, with different people running who want the organisation to put more resources towards different things. Some of these disagreements are expressed at the branch level. Some of it is expressed at the chapter level. So often certain chapters are dominated by certain caucuses, and the caucuses will have a theory of change, and you can see some pretty intense factional war at the level of chapters often to try and direct them in, either electoralist direction or a kind of like rank and file worker organising direction. And then I think one specific one to point to is New York DSA. So like New York DSA is probably seen as the most successful DSA branch in terms of its, got massive membership, and it's obviously elected Zoran and loads of other DSA electeds, etc., etc. And there are lots of contextual reasons as to why it might be the most successful. It is the capital city. There are lots of people that want to join DSA. There's a high density of people. there's loads of good reasons as to why it might be the most successful. But they've had a very contentious relationship with national DSA for a long time, to the point where they've nearly broken away and formed their own organisation multiple times. And that's often been in response to people who they don't agree with and who have a different theory of change, getting too much power in the National Committee and wanting to do things such as censor DSA electeds who have stepped in the wrong direction on Palestine or other issues. So yeah, it's kind of like a crazy coalition of forces to keep together. And I think one of the reasons they can keep it together, frankly, is because they're not a political party. They don't have to have that sense of centralization and going in the same direction as a party needs to, and so can go off in lots of different directions in these different ways.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into my final point, which is your party is still stuck between lots of visions of what it wants to be. Is it going to be an electoral party that, fights local and national elections, and that's where all of its energy and resources goes into? Is it going to be an organisation that's focused more on this historic realignment of the socialist movement that involves the trade unions and social movements? Or is it going to be a more ideological organisation that focuses on shifting the Overton window more to the left? And there are these different visions and different conceptions. And some of these things you can do a little bit together. Some of them are a bit more opposed. If you want to win elections, then tacking to the very far and radical left might be an imposition to that. If you want to, for example, realign the socialist movement and realign the trade union movement together and cohere them into one place, are you going to be able to do that in a context where all of your resources and all of your time and all of your energy is going into elections as opposed to kind of on the ground social movements? So I think, I keep bringing it back to the CEC elections, but actually they're very relevant. I love them. It's very relevant in terms of this conversation around party form and what party form is right for our moment. There are going to be some factors that are objective, that are structural, that are material, that determine that: our movement history, our current political economy, the current state of our politics. And then there are going to be some things that are a little bit more arbitrary, like who wins the CEC election and what their personalities and, style of politics are like. And yeah, it's really hard to say now what bits we can take from the PTB, what bits we can take from the DSA, when there is so much about your party that is still unknown.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think the kind of paucity of meaningful conversations about what kind of party you actually want and how that fits into the country you live in and the circumstances that you face, that's just not happening. And it's something that I really hope that this is a bit more of a launch pad for us to have on this podcast over the next few months. And because I think at the heart of Joe's report, I don't like calling it a report because it's more interesting than that. That's that it's asking what kind of organizational design fits in particular places. And I'm trying to think about Britain. It's a medium-sized country, specifically relative to the US and Belgium, racially differentiated and uneven. Similar issues confronting people in different places, but the kind of institutional settings of particular places, difference between Stoke and London, for example, the levers of power, the associational cultures, the kind of structures of feeling, they're all really different. In my opinion, we may disagree on this, there's a complete absence of a kind of sufficiently democratic and dynamic national Marxist political centre producing kind of communist cadre on a significant scale. And I think perhaps less than both cases, and I say all this without idealizing these two countries and their lefts, right? We have some strengths that they don't as well, and we should get into that at some point. But I do think the British left suffers from the kind of relative absence of ideologically developed, deep, widespread political traditions on the left, which in some cases that means people are more flexible, which can be a good thing, but it also means people are less organized and less politically cogent. So I'm not providing any massive conclusions from all of this, but it's just some of the factors that we have to consider when we kind of figure out that question of organizational design in this country, which kind of makes me want to ask you, Joe, what kind of organizational design you think is best, with no demand that you actually answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, no way I'm going to answer that question. No. I'll give it a go. I mean, it depends. I think it depends for who and what's the composition of the organisation and which organisation are we talking about? So, say, looking at your party at the moment, you could imagine your party incorporating elements of the DSA, such as the caucuses, you know, being like a core part of that. I could see that. Could I see your party or the Green Party ever being democratic centralist organizations with like a militant cadre in the middle? No, like there's not going to be that, because there's a certain amount of DNA that's baked into those organizations now, right? Because of the way that they formed and because of their histories. Even with your party, like if you start as a broad organization, I don't think you can then actively put together an ideologically coherent militant layer, especially when the leadership are not ideologically coherent in any sense at all. So I just think that, you know, there are limitations in terms of the context of the country that we're operating in, but there are also just limitations as to the context of the organizations that we're trying to change and mold and shape. I mean, you know, I think that there is a third way of thinking about this, though, which is like, do we, especially if your party may crash and burn at some point, and, you know, like, I'm not pronouncing it dead, but, you know, we don't really know the direction of that organization. There is possibly still a gap in the UK for another organization, another socialist or Marxist organization.
No.
Yeah, no, totally.
No, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it.
I think totally. No, I think totally. Which basically unites, you know, like socialists and communists and Marxists who are in all parties and none, which doesn't run candidates itself. So this organisation would be a socialist organisation. It would not be a party. And I think in some ways it would look like the DSA, because it would, you know, incorporate loads of organising work and some electoral work where you'd be supporting some Green candidates, maybe even some Labour left candidates, maybe some Your Party candidates, who the fuck knows. But it may also incorporate some elements of the PTB, which I think maybe is their emphasis on dedication and commitment and, you know, building an organisation that it is both ours, but that we are also dedicated to actually seeing succeed. I want to be in an organisation that I think is good enough and also have enough power over to be like, yeah, I will give 10% of my income every year to this organisation. That's the organisation I want to be in. And I don't think it's going to end up being democratic centralist in the way that the PTB is, because I just don't think we have that history. And I think amongst, especially like millennials and Gen Z, we've just grown up in an incredibly kind of like liberal pluralist culture where you're allowed to say what you want. The idea that we're suddenly going to join a party and then like not say things on social media that contradict the party line, I think is crazy. That's not going to happen. But like, I at least have a yearning to be in an organisation which has a sense of discipline and focus and mission and commitment, and people demonstrate that commitment, and that commitment is asked of me as well. Like I want that.
All right. Well, what a rich conversation and episode. Thank you so much, friends. So to wrap up, we're going to take you through our readings for this week. So I've actually been reading Tony Bunyan's History and Practice of Political Policing in Britain. And Tony Bunyan was an incredible advocate for civil liberties in this country. He was a journalist, an activist, and I would also say a historian. And this book really takes apart how the British state is set up to control and oppress and coerce the working class, both in terms of its kind of legislature, like, you know, conspiracy laws and the Official Secrets Act, and also its state infrastructure, so the police, special branch, MI5. And he really takes you through this powerful story of how the kind of British state keeps the working class down through authoritarianism, through legality, and through repression. So yeah, definitely check out Tony Bunyan. Joe, what are you reading?
So I came across an amazing article in Places Journal called Parks and Houses for the People by Johan Priest, Eric Jonsson and Don Mitchell. And it basically catalogues the rise of social democracy in Sweden, which, you know, became what is now neoliberalized, but had a stage before that where it became very kind of like state-led and bureaucratized, but had a stage before that in the mid to late 20th century where it was actually kind of like very grassroots and driven in this like autonomous fashion. And in that moment, a lot of the socialist organizations had this problem where they couldn't find anywhere to meet. There were just not big enough venues in the cities in Sweden to meet. So they started setting up these houses and parks of the people, which initially were just meeting spaces that were open to left groups, but also just like communities. But they took off in this massive way, and they managed to take over like old aristocratic homes and build these incredibly beautiful and well sculpted and ornate people's gardens that, you know, created this culture of kind of public luxury and like luxury for the people. And it's just written really, really well. And I obviously see kind of like modern resonances in some of the conversations we have about how like a socialist organization or a left party like needs to open spaces and create spaces in which people can interact with each other and create, you know, community and solidarity. So yeah, I just really, really recommend it.
Thanks, Joe. And Jonas.
An essay that really just struck me is Gabriel Wynant's latest essay in N+1 magazine. It's called "We Found Love in a Hopeless Place." It's on the kind of something we've talked about on this episode, the advances and limits of affect theory and how it interplays with organizing on the left in kind of moments of defeat and underlines a kind of left melancholy, a radical pessimism. He suggests that we would be better off replacing with a kind of generative live-in tradition of social organization based on political practice. I really recommend it. I will also just do a shameless plug this week and say that my book, Breaking of the English Working Class, which comes out in August, has been selected for the Waterstones pre-order campaign. Which means that from Tuesday the 17th of February at 7 a.m., that's tomorrow at 7 a.m., until Friday the 20th of February at midnight, you can pre-order the book on the Waterstones website and get a 25% discount if you enter Feb 26, all caps lock, except the 26, which is numbers, at the checkout. We'll put the link in the show notes.
Big up, Jonas.
Save.
And that's it for us today. We found love in a hopeless place. Let's end there. What a great message for this episode.
Cheers, Gabe.
Become a supporter of Life of the Party.
Yeah. Help us find love in a hopeless place by giving us your money. And we'll catch you in the next episode.
Bye.
Laters.